everyone. I would want to warmly welcome each and every one of you all for having been part of this great session. I would also want to thank the PMIPCC board members for having given me an opportunity to talk in this great event. And I'm sure each and every one of us will have an exciting learning session as we go down the line. Okay. So PMI, Suma, can I go ahead and share my content?
Yes, please.
So is my screen visible?
Yes.
Is screen visible to all? Okay, thank you so much. So this presentation, Embracing the Change Waves webinar series, is something that has been in practice for quite some time, and I have been working on this over the past 3 or 4 years. And on instances of multiple requests, I wanted to present the same topic in multiple forums, and here we are in this great day in the PMIPCC forum, where we are going to talk about the Change Wave webinar series. Okay. So the caption here, which we would want to talk about, is the agility in syndrome as against agile. We will be trying to learn more about this in our forthcoming session. The overall idea is about understanding, is there an elemental difference between the terms I can do it to can we do it? What is it that actually blurs the line between I can do it to can we do it is going to be the overall feature of the session. And that's about a brief about myself. I'm actually a change agent, and I am actually a training facilitator for multiple topics, which would include project management, agile, enterprise risk management, project scheduling, program scheduling, and portfolio scheduling techniques, business requirements analysis, governance, and execution of projects, programs, and portfolio. These are a couple of the few certifications which I hold, which I have just displayed, and that's a small picture about myself. This is the agenda. What are some of the rules of the human mention through Agile? How am I going to describe the exact livingness of each and every one of us here through the word Agile? And what is it that we call as one of the most abused words today? Transformation. Everywhere we keep on hearing about this word transformation, transition, adoption. We will try to understand over the course of the next few minutes, about the next 1.5 hours, about what is this transformation all about. And more so than ever, we will also try to understand what is the true spirit of oneness from a cross-functional team to deliver much more incremental values as we go down the line. Earlier, we were always talking about business verticals and horizontals. And today we are going to talk about a truly cross-functional, self-managed and a self-directed team. We will now try to find out what it is and what it takes to get ourselves empowered to ensure that the truly cross-functional behavior is embellished, decorated, and it shows itself the first time, the next time, and every time as we go down the line. Okay. This is what I would want to stress about. What is this so-called culture or cult behind agility? Every time we keep on hearing about the word agile or change, the first thing that we want to do is, what is it that we can do internally to avoid the change? The whole thing we need to understand is, change is one thing which has always been the paradigm ever since this universe began. And the more we try to resist change, the more change will start trying to attack each and every one of us, you, me, all of us alike. So how are we going to adapt to changing the change before change changes us once and for all? And as Albert Einstein, one of the greatest scientists and thought leaders, often quoted, the greatest height of insanity is actually doing the same thing over and over and again and expecting different results. So doing the same thing over and over again may make a person perfect in his or her activities. It may make a person ensure that the repeatability of the same activities are getting fine and prone. But the question Whether is it going to guarantee a difference in the results? That's remarkably questionable. And that's exactly what we have written here. If we are always doing what we have always been doing until now, we will only be getting whatever we have been getting until now. And it may not be possible for us to do something different. However, for us to get something different, we may be inclined to try to do something different. And how are we going to think with a difference in perception? Many a time in course of my project team engagements, I've always had these interactions with my team who always say whether agile and agile execution, is it about doing different things? I would say yes, it is about doing different things. But however, we need to understand that there is a fine element of difference between doing different things and things with a difference. And how are we going to guarantee that bit of an elemental difference is what we are going to understand in our course of webinar presentation. So we may all know, from those of us, we need to understand for us to get 1 gram of gold, practically we may have to invest at least 10 kilograms of gold in a sand mine. And it's not about efforts applied right, the right efforts meant. And only when the right efforts are applied, will we be able to get to understand how are we able to get the right level of gold. Fine? Okay. By the way, before we actually get into this, I'm just trying to see if we can open up a small poll and get an kind of an answer on how are we going to look at things. So basically, we will need to understand, is change something that is only in our projects, or is it something that we have been encountering in course of our execution? Change is something that is perennial in the universe ever since time began. And this change is something that has always been abided by time. And ever since the entities of change, time, and space are prevalent, the aspect of adoption, transition, and transformation are also always and will continue to be inculcated throughout the entire universe of creation. Okay? With this, I'd just like to see if I can just share a small video with you. Let us take a look at this and let us try to answer a few questions as we go down the line. Okay? Suma, is my video clear? Are you able to see my video?
It's coming in the known universe.
Yes. Yes.
Audio, I'm not
It'll come.
sure.
It'll come up. It'll come up. It'll come up. Is the audio? Is the audio? Is it audible now?
No, Shishadri.
Is it audible now?
No. Not yet, Shishadri.
It's visible now?
Visible, yes. Not audible.
Yes. Now? Is the audio there?
No.
Shishad, have you tried importing it in multimedia?
Yes.
Okay. That should
Sorry?
work. Yeah, then that should work. Yeah. If it is through multimedia, then that should work.
Yes.
Sheshadri, since we are not able to hear the audio, probably you can talk about what we are seeing on the screen so that
Yes,
it's easier.
sure.
DSK says you may have to change the computer audio from mic to computer.
Switch audio.
No worries. Probably you can just talk about what we are seeing on the screen so that it is easy.
Okay. Essentially, yeah. Yes. So essentially, this
Sheshadri, just a request from the folks. If you can share the link to the video so that they can see.
I will do that. I will do that. I will do that.
Okay.
Yes, yes,
Thank you.
sure, I will do that. So was the video not, the audio was not, it was not, the audio was not clear, right?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Yes. So the whole point in what I was actually trying to mention is the whole thing about change is about persistence. And the more we try to persist in adopting to change, it ensures that we are actually changing for the better. And we also need to understand that it's not about tough times. Tough times never last. However, tough characters do. This primarily talks about stakeholder engagement during course of execution. There could be a stakeholder who may really not want something to get done. There may be a stakeholder who may always want to get it done. So how are we actually going to do a balance of the two is primarily about the entire aspect of transformation. And we also need to understand that technologies are there today. The same technology can fail us tomorrow. However, if we need to understand that in our programming constructs, we may have a misplacement of a do and a while. However, if the team members start whiling away, when there is a do actually to be executed, then there's a real problem. There's a rule which always there in most of the execution processes, karma theories or whatever. Anything that we try to avoid just for the sake of it, be it real life or events or user stories or refinement action, tends to pile up over a period of time and it manifests its ugly face one fine day and it really becomes so huge that it becomes impossible to manage that. The idea is, are we actually able to break down whatever we see as debt items, backlog items to ensure that then and there the issues are nipped in the bud. So with this in mind, we are actually going to get into what is the state of transformation. Okay, so let me actually try to get into some elemental definitions of what we are going to talk about transformation. Let us first try to talk about what a project is. For the PMI, a temporary endeavor undertaken to create any unique service, transition, offering, or entity is what we call as a project. We also need to understand a project is primarily executed to bring in or usher in or factor in an element of change. And there is one more word which we need to understand. A project is always temporary. There is nothing called as a permanent project. A project is a temporary endeavor, and this ensures that an aspect of change is assured. Now, let us try to understand more about the fancy word which we keep on hearing every day, agile. An entity which is subject to consideration of change within a measured time factor. This is per the definition of the Oxford Webster's Dictionary. Something that is subject to change in a consideration of a time factor is what we call as agile. And because it represents a doing action, essentially agile is a verb. Now we keep on hearing something about the term agility and agility in syndrome, agility in requirements analysis, agility in action. We need to understand that though agile and agility are similar, they are not identical. Agility is a term which describes how agile an entity is. Because it is descriptive of the agile factor, it describes a verb, becomes an adverb. The other words which we describe about agility talk about responsiveness, swiftness, alertness, inclusiveness, whatever we talk about. So the term agility has a, sorry, did someone say something? Okay. So the term agility essentially is a larger term which imbibes the agile as a consideration factor. So agility is an adverb. Now let us talk about what a framework is. An outline which is primarily given to enact any philosophy or a work or activity is what you call as a framework. The most commonly used framework is Scrum. There are other methods like Kanban, extreme programming, agile engineering techniques like test-driven development, BDD, FDD, so on and so forth. Of which Scrum tend to be used more than often because it is simple to execute. So essentially, a framework is an outline to enact any given philosophy to get outwork of whatever business wants. Now let us try to understand what is a business case. A business case is actually a statement which describes a requirement for any business activity. Unless there's a business case, there's no question of a project getting executed. Now let us try to understand two terms which we have read way back in our 6th standard or 7th standard. What is a scalar? Any physical entity that can be measured or that can be described only with a term of a magnitude minus any directional coefficient is what we call as a scalar. There are reasons why I'm trying to bring in all these terminologies. We will understand as we go down the line. What is this? Why are we talking about scalars here? There's a reason, because when we talk about a scalar, it has only magnitude. There is no direction to it. A speed, area, mass, weight, whatever. Now, what is this vector? A physical entity which possesses both magnitude and direction is called as a vector. Thrust, force, velocity, displacement. Now, I would like to ask you all a question. Is the human mind a scalar or a vector? Is the human mind a scalar or a vector? A vector? How many of you say it's actually a scalar? How many of you say it's a vector? Because when we talk about the human mind, we cannot say that the human mind is about 5 millimeters in thinking or 5 newtons or 5 kilograms. Why is it a vector? The idea is the human mind is a vector because we talk about positivity in thinking and negativity in thinking. Because there is a positivity in thinking or a negativity in thinking, there is a direction alienation of these thoughts. And when we talk about thought direction, which has a focus, it attains power. And when it has power, we always say there is a level of faith that is imbibed. It's essentially a chain reaction. We are going to talk about this in the subsequent slides as well. And because there is a certain level of power imbibed, it attains momentum, which by itself is a vector. Okay. Now, let us try to understand the next term. Many a time we keep hearing, today I am in no state to talk about these requirements. Today I am in no condition to talk about the next steps. I am really, really unhappy with the state of behavioral activities. What is the state? Conventionally, from programming perspective, or development perspective, or any business execution perspective, we talk about the conditionals with which we measure certain entities. Let us talk about something from a very, very basic example about a fluid which we use daily, water. Water primarily has three descriptives of existence: a liquid state of water, a solid state of ice, and a gaseous state of steam. So it is possible for us to freeze water to make ice and possible for us to heat water to make it steam. But when we talk about the properties of ice, water, and steam, all of the three are different. They all belong to the same entity called water. The reason why we are talking about this is when we talk about a certain elemental number of variables with which you talk about the behavioral aspects of an entity under consideration, that becomes a descriptive of a term called state. I am sure each and every one of you during course of your earlier development activities would try to understand what is called as a state chart analysis or a state vector analysis. Primarily, if you talk about physical computing as well, a RAM or a segment of a memory is also called as a vector, high vector or a low vector. because it is in the vector analysis, we will be able to understand what is the state of any variable. Is the variable to be used for execution or is it to be knocked off execution? All of these descriptions and all of these computing activities will come during physical computing. Now, before we talk about transformation, we talk about something what we call as adapting to something which we see as a change. I'm executing my project in an environment and I see it is possible for me to do things better if I bring in some kind of activities which I call as best practices. It can add a delta or an increment of what some level of goodness in the project by which I'll be able to see better outcomes. Because I'm adopting some good practices, I tend to transition myself to consider those requirements, and over a period of time, it has started adding value for me. Now, let us say I talk about this earlier condition of existence in a graphical coordinate of +1, +1. The earlier segment, the new segment, which I'm going to talk about, probably will have a value, let us say +2, +2. Definitely +1 is not the same as +2, +2. In our conventional science experiments, we used to have an experiment where we used to talk about mixing iron powder and sand and then run a magnet over it. We will see that the magnet tends to attract the iron powder, leaving behind the sand. What happens? You are physically separating the two constituents without altering the composition. However, I'm just taking the same sand and iron mixture and I'm adding some acid to it. There's a chemical compound that gets created. And now when I'm running an magnet over it, the likelihood of this magnet attracting the iron filings is relatively less. What happens? It has altered the state of behavior by which you will be able to respond to the external surroundings. What is transformation now? Navigating through an unknown journey. Why is it we talk about navigating through an unknown journey? Essentially, when we are trying to find out multiple things, there could be state of analysis of variables by which I know certain things are known, certain things are unknown. For certain things, I know the way further. For certain things, I do not even know for what purpose they have been put up in. See, primarily speaking, in our spiritual life as well, we talk about sun and moon as the guiding life of the entire systems. And it so happens that the two entities tend to get covered up momentarily during portion of an eclipse. And during portion of an eclipse, it is either the moon or the earth which comes in between the sun, and then respective solar eclipses or lunar eclipses happen. And what happens is during an eclipse, it's completely blacked out. What happens? You do not know the way further. It's actually a black box. I try to do all the things internally, navigate, try to shoot in the dark to find out what is it I want out of this entire exercise. When I try to do what it is to find out what are the entire exercise, it essentially becomes my learnings, which I aggregate. And slowly, as you start aggregating the learnings over a period of time, you will see that there is a small elemental bit of knowledge. And that bit of knowledge is which we call in our Sanskrit as attainment of jnana or wisdom. What happens? We tend to understand what is this internal light which has come up. And as I go further down the line, this light broadens up and the attainment of true wisdom and knowledge is what you call as transformation. Why is this attainment of knowledge and wisdom so much of importance? It is because when we talk about state of existence, 5 years back and 5 years hence, the way we behave, the way we perceive, the way we show attachment towards things, and the way we consider the outcomes earlier had a metric of value, and today the metric of value which we are attaching to these two things have a subtle, have a fine, and have in fact have largely defined variables of measurement which we may not be able to correlate what happened 5 years or 10 years down the line. I will give you a classic example. 5 years back, every time when we talk about a work from home, the first thing that I have seen from any supervisor, a frown in the face. Why do you want to work from home? Today, when we talk about a work from home, the first thing it is guaranteed. Can you see the alteration of state? What was no earlier has now become a yes now. And what was become a yes earlier has become a no today. So basically, when we talk about transformation, it is about attainment of internal knowledge, and internal knowledge alone is not sufficient. We need to have a knowledge of the external surroundings. The internal knowledge plus the knowledge of the external surroundings helps us understand how to map requirements, which could be finer dots, which could be dots, and which could be firm line requirements. This helps us understanding what are the line items of the acceptance criteria and how are we able to articulate those line items of the acceptance criteria towards seeing what can actually be perceived as the new future, or what we term as emergent requirements. Essentially, when we talk about the deep protocol in requirements analysis, we have something called as detailed, estimated, emergent, and prioritized. And emergent requirement is something which you will be able to correlate only when you are able to contest and understand the finer element of dots between requirements which are told and untold. So with this, we essentially try to understand that transformation is essentially an awakening. It's about essential change of state and alteration of the coordinates, by which you will find it extremely difficult to go back to the earlier ways of working, because you have seen that there are drastic alterations in the measurement of outcomes. And because the outcomes are drastic, the changes tend to be drastic. And you will see that the change aspect as such is something that is done for the better. Why are we talking about transformation? This helps us understand, uncover hidden entities. You see, first, a man evolved as an ape, and today he's a person who's either trying to do an act for Chandrayaan, Mangalyaan, or any other expedition of the celestial bodies. So as a monkey, a man was just a primate. But today, if you see, he's able to look, think, and attain at what we call as a seventh sense, or maybe even the ninth sense, which is something which you are all thinking in course of high-level consciousness or thinking. Now, this is something which will help us understand that a new line of business, a new activate of thinking, a new trigger is going to come up, by which we will be able to relate knowledge from the past, understand how it is being executed now for a progressive future. This is also going to serve as, help us a template by which life shall never be the same it used to exist earlier. It has to change. If it is not going to change, change will change us. And earlier, we were always accustomed to talking about terms like cooperation, competition. The point is, this is what we call as a college to a corporate transition, which I have worked with a couple of pass out individuals. Many a time, we are attributed to get more marks, get scoring pointers. What is the whole idea? When I'm trying to get more marks and more scoring pointers, it helps me think that I'm the person who's going to lead the initiative. But the minute I transition myself from a college to a corporate, it seems that this competitive spirit was good to help me get into the show, but it is not going to help me sustain there. Sustenance is the key. So that kind of a thinking mindset, which helps me perceive the fact that what I thought was a state of existence or supreme existence is not even a metric of window in today's measurement. So then I need to understand that cooperation with my team, cooperation with my peers, cooperation with my stakeholders, cooperation with my superiors is something that shall help me see what is the light of the day. Today, it is not even competition or cooperation. We talk about collaboration. What is this collaboration? It is a realization from competition towards cooperation, by which the better thinking helps us align to a fact that unless I shake hands with my persons in the college, I may not be able to attain outcomes. The point is, in cooperation, I can still perceive a person to be my the person with whom I do not want to work with, but I'm working with for the sake of getting things done. However, when I'm talking about collaboration, I can see him as my sworn enemy. A developer and a tester normally never get together. However, when I'm going to talk about a cross-functional team, unless the two of them shake hands together, it is not going to see any minimum viable product. Because you're not going to see any minimum viable product, the marketable features are just not going to exist, or it will be incomplete. So the overall area of understanding is to help understand that the true business potential is something that has to be attained only in an ocean of turbidity. Something that is smooth is not going to set clear directions. Unless there is an air of turbidity, this is the time when we actually tend to work best to ensure that we deliver the best, we showcase the best outcomes, and we also are able to see how are we able to deliver to the best potential of the businesses, the clientele, and the stakeholders. What is the bottom line? It's a complete change of state of thought It's a complete change of delineation of thinking. It's a complete changeover and a complete makeup to ensure that the way we perceive, the way we enact, the way we not only react, but respond to the changeover in the situation is something that changes not today, but has going to change forever. Clear? Generally, we talk about customers who always want the moon, right? How many of the customers you think are simple enough, who think that they give pretty simple requirements? Have I ever seen anybody in my audience who feels that a customer gives simple requirements? Is there anybody in my audience who says, I want my customer only asks for simple requirements? Very rare, very rare. Yes, yes. Essentially, the customers want everything, right? But is it possible to demand everything? Is it possible for us to give everything? Yes, we will see this. How did a customer describe his need? He wanted the moon, right? The big glowing moon. And before we actually understood or analyzed the customer's requirement, what did we think about a customer? He wanted to fly around the moon, right? The customer described the moon. We did not even get to the extent of understanding what the customer really meant by the moon. We thought he actually wanted the moon itself, right? And what did we do? It's not possible for us to directly land on the moon, right? So we think he wants to fly around the moon in a bright, moony night so that he can see the big glow of the moon after sunset, right? Now, after build and complete decisions, we always want to show something to the customer that we are experts in giving solutions to the customers, right? Let us see. After analysis, design, we gave the customer all these breed of high powerful aircraft because the customer wanted the moon, right? He's anyway going to fly around the moon. So we want to give him a high power aircraft to ensure that he sees the moon. Now, after we have given him a prototype of the solution, what did a customer think? He felt probably an aircraft may not suffice. We will see that. We will see that. What the customer exactly wanted, the customer himself is trying to investigate. The customer thinks perhaps if I need to see the moon, I may need a high powered rocket, because I have seen customers who clearly do not understand what is a fine element of difference between a need and a want. A want is something that you actually put in a product backlog. If I need this, it is something that is definitely time driven. A product backlog essentially goes through prioritization, and then if the customer's needs are delivered, it attains its final goal. So when the customer feels that, yes, I have to go to the moon, this is probably what I may be needing as a final requirement, he or she describes with the stakeholders, and then they feel, oh yeah, we are going to invest, and this is what we are going to ensure that this project is going to be successful. Do you want to see the final outcome of this project? Anybody wants to see the final outcome of the project? We had detailed discussions, right? Yes, no, maybe. You want to see the final outcome? This was a requirement. How did the customer describe? He described the moon. What did we think? He wanted to fly around the moon. What did we do after a need and an analysis built? We built every possible aircraft, having all kind of prime movers, high-powered engines, and say you can fly around the moon 365 days. Customer felt, no. This is not what I meant. I wanted a rocket. And then finally, after discussion with stakeholders and business influencers, the customer himself identified that this was a requirement. Now, did you see that the margin of error of getting the difference between requirements correct versus correct requirements, is it something of the order of 300%? Can you now understand the level of impact it has on the project financials, the project schedules, and the overall churn in scope. Do you think this is something that is manageable when we are met with such a requirement? Map this to your real-time scenarios where you have seen such real-time instances and where the overall project capsized because the gradation percentage of the requirements was of the order of 300%. Have you ever encountered this kind of a scenario? Anytime? Why? How many of us have not encountered this kind of a scenario? We have all heard of the company called Ford, right? Ford Motor Corporation. Henry Ford initially had a discussion with his customers. You know what was the requirement that was given by the customers during the early start of his days? Any idea? The customers told, we wanted fast horses. So the idea is the customers themselves do not know. The customers themselves do not know what they want. And it is up to us, we as people sitting on the other side of the table, helping customers to uncover what they exactly want and what exactly is needed. That is where story mapping and precedence artifacts come into picture. Shall we now see the next slide? Shall we now try to do a retrospect? Well, this is one of my favorite movies, The Lion King, where Simba essentially tries to avoid getting hit and he tries to run away. And finally, what does Simba essentially do? What you are actually talking about in terms of granularity of requirement is probably a few in a large subset. I am talking about a sizable portion where the requirement granularity is seldom seen. Unless you do the analysis yourself, it's very, very unlikely that you're going to see the light of the day. So Simba tries to run away from the problem, and he feels that the more he tries to run away from the problem, it doesn't work. There's a saying, I really like the saying in some of the forums which I read, always try to face your problems. Do not Facebook your problems. And the other thing is, please try to understand the problems and try to solve it for yourself. Do not try to broadcast your problems. 80% of the world are happy that you have this problem, and 20% of the people in the world really don't care. So how are we going to address this? Simba realizes that the only way to run away or the only way to escape is not running away, but to break the stick which the monkey was beating him with. Right? Now let us try to understand the retrospective. Did we ask the customer correct requirements? Or were we always reclining on our past glories, thinking that I have done such things in the past, for me it is nothing. I will definitely be able to crack the ice. What happened? That kind of high-headedness, the kind of incorrect estimates that actually ran in our mind without getting into the deeper aspects of the problem, essentially posed a bigger problem that we were not even able to understand what the customer wanted in the first place. The gap of requirements had an error margin of 300%. What happened? The correct level of probe of business possibilities completely vanished from the screen. And because the correct scope of requirements vanished, what happens? Let us try to understand this from business perspective. It has been estimated that in the scope of requirements analysis, out of every 100 requirements, 75 to 80% of the requirements are poor, don't have description, or the requirements which are given are practically meaningless. So if you see, the state of success of projects is practically just 33%, not because of great challenges, but because of poor scope. And poor scope is attributed to poor requirements. The primary aspect of success or failure of a project begins with the first point, scope. Unless we try to get what is actually needed in this project, the next steps is likely to have more and more margin of error. Why is it that we are trying to wish away the possibility, saying that this meant more work? We need to understand that the more and more you try to avoid, the more and more possibilities are that just postponing the activities is just going to add more and more debt to that problem, and it's going to dawn upon us at the most inopportune instance. I will give you an example. During course of our project existence and execution in our agile projects, we tend to understand that this testing is sufficient. Let us just give it to the UAT guys. Let them find this out. And the UAT guys come back to us and say that this is not tested at all. This has not been uncovered. There are so many bugs here. Over a period of time, we'll tend to burn midnight oil, and the customer is not going to pay for rework. It is not only going to end up in we doing the rework, we are also going to get more and more bad name. The goodwill is lost, and whatsoever, the customer is not going to pay for rework. So the whole idea is, if we actually sat down with the customer and say that, boss, this is the prototype which we have got. Is this exactly what you want? Are you trying to talk about something way in this line, or are we trying to deviate from the scope of what is actually described in here? This is where personas as feature come up. And during course of this entire execution, we will help customers understand what he thought of as a requirement was not at all a requirement, and what he did not envisage as a requirement was actually the one which ended up in success factor of the project. Now, how many times do we actually challenge the customer, or we just say yes to the customer? And because we do not challenge the customer feels that he is actually giving correct requirements, whereas we feel that during course of our uncovering the requirements in terms of story mapping, related activities of estimation, we find that the requirements by themselves are unclear, and because unclear requirements, it tends to add more and more debt. Not only in development, because the development has a debt, the technical QA teams add more debt, and over a period of time, we have heard of this term called BSOD from Microsoft, right? How many of us have not heard of this term BSOD? Have you all heard, or have you all not heard about this? BSOD. It is called as the blue screen of death. A system freeze when an illegal memory mapping and illegal hit of a memory by which incorrect interrupt request or incorrect vector mapping happened, and the system is unable to handle the load, it just crashes. It so happened that the more and more dump files are created, the more and more weaker the software solution becomes, or the solution becomes, and it eventually cracks whatever we did right from day one, and we'll end up doing the same thing over and over again. The expectation is, when we are talking about requirements analysis, the expectation is we need to set a thought leadership plane by which I help the customer understand that if you are thinking like this, this is going to be the outcome. How are you going to get that? Unless we try to uncover requirements for the customer. As I told you, if Ford was not willing to uncover more and more requirements, probably they would have designed swifter horses. But then they understood that this is not going to happen, because there is no possibility by which I can increase the horsepower of a horse, but I can definitely increase and add value to the horsepower of an engine. So it is about understanding the fine element of need versus a want, by which I will be able to add value iteratively, incrementally, and sustainably over a period of time. Right? Yes. Have you all heard of this entity called as a chain reaction? How many of us have not heard of something called as a chain reaction? Chain reaction. Yes, no, maybe. You've all heard of chain reactions? How many of us have not heard of something called as a Agile Manifesto? Have you all heard of this Agile Manifesto? Okay. For those of us who have not heard of something called as Agile Manifesto, I will talk about this. A team of Agile experts actually sat at a location called Utah, UTAH, and they felt that conventional plan-driven techniques are good. But if you're going to talk about a stream of execution where the changes in requirements are more, plan-driven techniques may not be able to answer the solution. We may need to talk about how we are going to bring in solutions not only iteratively, but incrementally, by which the whole solution becomes adaptive. And they arrived at something what is called as a manifesto for agile execution. The first line item is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. I talk to you, you talk to me. More than my talking to you and you talking to me, I try to script all these things in a mail. A mail may not be able to actually convey the same emotions. The point is, we are all human beings and we have a coefficient of emotional attachment, emotional thinking, and that is something we need to see during course of our interactions. The idea to understand here is, as an individual and interaction, we tend to understand more about the challenges, the problems, the pain areas, and also the good points, whichever a customer or any entity we talk about is over processes and tools. A process and tool comes into picture over and above the individuals and interactions, but process and tools cannot be substitutes for individual interactions, and that too for agile execution in particular. Because individuals and interactions are given precedence over process and tools, eventually what happens? A customer is an individual, a team member is an individual, a stakeholder is an individual, a person who is responsible for the project management or a program management or a portfolio management office is an individual. The managing organizing bodies, the steering committees are individuals. What happens? They collaborate with each other over any kind of contract negotiation. Contract negotiation essentially talks about what we can do, what we cannot do. But when a customer collaborates, it's about getting in a win-win. And when the customer feels that there is a value add because of this interaction over an individual and interaction, he feels, yes, I am an integral part of the execution. Contrast this with plan-driven initiatives, where the customer actually comes during the 9th month or 10th month of the execution, and he says, I've given the requirements, I'm not going to interfere in between, and this is exactly what I want. This is what I wanted. I'm not going to interfere. During the 9th month or the 10th month, during course of the delivery, the customer says, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I wanted. Did I describe you this? How many of you have not experienced this scenario? Please type in the chat box. How many of you have not experienced a scenario where you heard the customer, this is not what I wanted? And then lawsuits, legal suits, discussion, all kind of disagreements, war of words, finger pointing happens. Why? When I, as an individual, is not taking complete interest in what work is happening, when there is a change in the project, I should not be blaming the project team. Now, when you contrast this in execution with an adaptive or an agile execution, the customer is a key stakeholder. Unless there is a customer sign off in execution during a 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, or a 4 week iteration span, the story does not get accepted. There is nothing called as a partially accepted story. Either it is an accepted story or it is an unaccepted story. These partially accepted stories do not reside, or it is moved over for execution. Are you all in agreement with me? There is nothing called as an incomplete, in a partially done story. Either it is a work in progress or it is done. This is where a definition of ready story gets translated to a definition of done. Now, let's come back to the manifesto. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? This gives a scenario where the customer collaboration is seen more as a pleasant, or sometimes it may be unpleasant, but over a period of time, we see that customer collaboration is a must over contract negotiation. A contract can always be negotiated, but customer collaboration is seen as a must. Trust me, customer collaboration and agile are two hands of the same entity called body. Minus customer collaboration, there's nothing called as an agile project. So if the direct customer is not there, either a customer's proxy or a representative, a scribe of the customer in terms of a business analyst or a business scribe is present, what happens? There is something called as an entity of change. And because there is an entity of change, this person starts responding to this. Okay, in my story mapping, I may not be able to factor a design consideration because the technical dependency is high. Let us try to move this to the subsequent release or iteration. So what happens? The detailed plan gets a secondary subset, and the responding to change or responsiveness to change comes into picture. By the way, do we know what is the fine element of difference between reaction and responsiveness? Yes, no, maybe. Do you think there's a difference between reactivity and responsiveness? Right. Okay. Right? Yes. How many of you feel there is no difference? Both reaction and responsiveness are same. How many of you feel no difference? Okay. Now let me get to some very elemental science. Okay. We say that a piece of charcoal burns in oxygen to give carbon dioxide. Or rather, we say that carbon reacts with oxygen to give carbon dioxide. Does carbon think before it burns in oxygen? Right? And let us say, generally, entities not having the rational coefficient, animals and other entities, they tend to fight over petty things. So what happens? First animal bites, the second animal tries to react, and then there is a squabble, and then there is hitting, and then there is gory all over. But let us try to comprehend with the sixth degree of thinking, which is rational thinking. I am attending a session, and then all of a sudden my friend taps me, and then I get annoyed. But I know for a fact that he does not tap me without any reason. I get to see that the customer's representative is coming, and I'm trying to understand something about estimates internally, which is something that is private to our way of working. What happens? Will I get annoyed with him, or will I thank him for this alert? Why? The reason is simple. There is a thinking coefficient attached to this overall reactive phenomena. And because there is a thinking phenomena attached to the reaction coefficient, you start responding. A reactive is active. Responsiveness comes as a result of behavior attachment. It is because we all humans have a responsiveness as a behavioral coefficient. The human resources or the hiring team has assigned each and every person roles and responsibilities, not roles and reactivities, roles and responsibilities. And that is how responding to change is attained over following a detailed plan. Now let us talk about the first three lines: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a detailed plan. Eventually, what is the final outcome? We all want the last line item, right? Working software over comprehensive documentation. I've seen people say there's a very good usage of this book, how to use the phone. Tell me, over the last 15 years, how many of us have got a smartphone having a manual? Have anybody got a manual for using a smartphone? Why? The reason is simple. It is the basis of agile engineering, agile applications. Essentially, when I try to bring in a smartphone by trying to understand the look, feel of the features, I get to understand that this is how the customer perceives the behavior. This is how the customer wants this entire screen display to be. And if this customer does not want, it gets rejected. That is what we call as test designed development or test designed outcomes. Test first development. I'm doing testing on whatever the customer wants, because like I test whatever the customer wants. It is what we call as test first development or test designed development. Because it is both first and designed, becomes test driven development. We're just going a step backward, trying to understand why is it test driven development. And because there is something called as test driven development, what happens is just Yes, it is just a kind of an interface. I'll give you an example. When we are designing a car, we often hear of airbags, gas bags, and chairs which actually retract or completely fill to ensure that in uneven event of the car meeting with a crash, the inner passengers should not be affected. There's a lot of testing which happens to ensure that the inner passengers who are traveling inside the car are protected at the expense of the vehicle. So that kind of testing that happens to ensure that the customers are protected is what you call as test driven development, test focused development, right? Airbags can hit straight at your face. It could be very painful. Sometimes it can cause unwanted sneezing. It can cause nasal bleeding. How do we get all of these findings? It is only when you start doing this test related activities. Now I have aggregated the results. I've seen all the findings of the retrospectives, and I see that there are certain areas which I can definitely knock off to ensure that the customer satisfaction is guaranteed. How do I do that? The gas bags, it should not hit directly on face. It should be a kind of a soft cushioning material. The glass should shatter inside out, not outside in. At the same time, the belt should lock the passenger. What happens? After getting the increments, inputs from test, defined, and design development, you talk about behavioral patterns. A test driven development essentially designs interfaces. A behavioral driven development essentially connects emotions. Unless you have an interface, you cannot connect an emotion. And how will you be able to connect an emotion? Only when there is an interface. This is one of the prime reasons why we talk about TDD as a precursor to BDD. We need to have both in hand, and we cannot exclude one from the other. Now let us come back to the manifesto, which talks about working and tested software over comprehensive documentation. We often, in our daily execution of work, we say that no, you should not talk. Customer collaboration should not be there. Customer is a big pain in the wrong place. You should not respond. How on earth can you have working software? Don't you think all the 4 line items are very, very closely knit to ensure that you are all getting what you actually want without rework? Don't you think there is a fine elemental pattern which is falling in place over the Agile Manifesto by itself? Are you able to see that fine element of connect within all the 4 lines? And individuals and interactions over personal tools will definitely give rise to customer collaboration. Because there is customer collaboration, there is responsiveness to change. And because there is responsiveness to change, there will have to be working software. There is no second thought about it. Is this clear? Thank you so much for the customer feedback. Today, you are all my customers. Thank you so much. Okay. Let us now try to understand the concept of a chain reaction from oneness in business. The first, which we have seen here, is a nuclear weapon, right? I'm just giving you some equation which I've just copied from standard 8 physics, science. And this gives rise to 3 million electron volts of energy. Even I've forgotten what it is all about. But then I've seen that the level of devastation, which is uncontrolled, tends to be so far that even today, you go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you may not have much growth. So the point which I'm trying to convey here is, you talk about self-organization, self-management, but we need to understand that with self-management, responsibility is an untold feature and accountability is a second feature. You empower them and you ensure that you do that so that it gets translated to outcomes. This is exactly the fine element of a difference between a nuclear weapon and the same nuclear element which is used for generating power. A nuclear weapon is going to give power that is uncontrolled. You may not be able to control the outcome. However, the chain reaction on a nuclear reactor is something that can definitely use for power harnessing. It's a sustainable source of power. Trust me, one of the most sustainable, and the way in which power systems is undisrupted. There is a risk in the process. I'm not going to talk about that. We are going to talk about the essential elemental way in which you compare the two in terms of a chain reaction process alone. The risks, the uncertainties is something that we'll talk about in a later session, not in today's section. Today's session is about understanding the concept of chain reaction. Sustained chain reaction and unsustained chain reaction are two different entities. A chain reaction which is unsustained is devastating. And a chain reaction which is sustained tends to give positive and beneficial results, right? Now let us try to dwell on this. During course of a transformation process, the organization stability is often questionable. Why? The way in which we executed businesses, we have always been used to doing things like this. We do not want to look at change at all. Such kind of organizations generally perish because we have seen change is the only thing which is permanent. And you do not accept change, change will change you. Why do you think the cone of uncertainty as a factor is brought in here? From the time a requirement is perceived till the time a requirement is delivered, there is high uncertainty till such time it is accepted by the customer. And now I've seen that during course of these kind of turbidities, the organization is going through a large change, which I may like, I may not like. If I don't like, I might as well put my profile in Naukri. Okay, thank you. So let us see. I'm going to find myself another place. Now, let me sustain in this place and see what is it that they are going to deliver. Let us also try to see what is it that I am going to have as a learning. Essentially, when we talk about transformation, a transformation is essentially not an outside-in experience. It's an inside-out experience. What is it that I am going to add as a value in the entire system? Whether it is good, bad, ugly is a different story. What is it that I am going to contribute? It is either going to be a successful outcome or it is going to be a retrospective. The way in which you take it is something decides the skill factor or the will factor. I can teach an organization, I can teach an entity a skill factor. I can definitely not teach an organization or entity a will factor. This is where we talk about how are we going to address change. And if you do not address change today, there will be one day where you have to address change. And at that point in time, the cost of accommodating change at level 0 is 10x. The cost of accommodating change at lot change is 1000x. You understand the gradient? Overall, what is going to be my retrospective? I want my transformation process to give me significant lessons on definitely how not and definitely how. I want, these are all definite learning action outcomes as to how it is going to explain the people inside me that a change is something that is always for the better. Change has to happen. Change is something that is destined to happen, and change will invariably happen. Either I embrace change or I'll be forced to embrace change. And over a period of time, you will see that I have always been doing things. So I can say I can do it. But today, in a cross-functional team behavior, if I say I can do it, is seen as a lower level of measurement. But can we do it is the first thing, because a group team empowerment is something that is seen as a bigger measure of success. Now, the other thing is, if I do not take risks today, I will never be able to take risks later. Because that no risk attitude is something that is a bigger change. It is definitely going to give bigger disaster down the line. And last but not the least, I have seen that the same lethal nuclear weapon is either a devastating weapon or it is something that can be turned into beneficiary weapon. The discretion is purely human because no machine can replace this reply. Now, let me summarize this with one question. Which do you think is the biggest project you have ever seen? I repeat whatever I have spoken as a definition of a project. A temporary endeavor undertaken to generate a unique service, transition, offering, or business outcome. A project is always temporary. Can I now say that the human life by itself is a project? The only difference is the human life as such is temporary. Start date is known. The divine felt that the unknown, which is the end date. It's not to be disclosed unless you see it for yourself. Because entire human life is a project, and because the human life is sustained throughout an entity which we call as change, and change is factored into agile. Can I now say that the human life by itself is agile? I'm essentially getting into a mathematical proposition where I say A into B cross C is nothing but A into B cross C. It is commutative. Can I also say that because the concept of change is imbibed very much in human life, it is very much in the process of the time factor? And the minimum viable product which a man or a woman sees in her life is nothing but a man or a woman. Right? Agreed? Chapter, honorable board members, I'm more or less done with my presentation. Are we well within our schedule baseline?
Absolutely, Mr. Sheshadri. Time, scope, everything well within time, well within all the baselines. And that was a wonderful, wonderful talk on change, embracing it and celebrating it as well. So let me take over the screen share, if I may, Mr. Sheshadri.
Please, please, please.
Yeah. We will display this information also shortly again, your coordinates. Meanwhile, let us, sorry, are you able to see the screen or wait?
I have unshared my screen.
Yes. So just let's open up this forum for questions. If any, you can paste in the chat window. And while we are at it, if you like the session, I'd request all the associates to please provide your feedback in LinkedIn at the post that I have shared just in the chat window. Any questions? Feel free to ask. I will take it up with Mr. Sheshadri now. And feedback, if any, I request associates to take it up or post it in the LinkedIn. The post link, I have given it right in the chat window. We have our first question from Pavan, Mr. Sheshadri, is iteration and increment a vector?
Good question. The answer, whether it is a vector or a scalar, comes with the very, very basic elemental definition of a scalar and a vector. If an increment is actually taking the project in the next direction, it becomes a vector. If it is halting a project, then and there itself, it becomes a scalar.
Mm-hmm.
It's a magnitude that counts.
Okay. Pavan, does that answer your question? You may respond in the chat window. Great.
Thank you so much, Pavan.
Any other questions, guys?
It is actually a potentially shippable product increment. When we talk about potentially shippable product increment, a shippable entity is something that has magnitude. It becomes a vector.
Sure. Okay, we have another question in the chat window. Change will arise after risk identification or after identified risk, change will be raised.
It's a very good
would you like to rephrase that question?
Yes, I've seen the question. Anyway, I've seen the question. Anyway, yeah. I would like to hear it from you again.
Ravikant, would you like to rephrase it?
Okay. Good question. See, let us try to understand two things. A change is essentially an alteration of state, right? Now, when we talk about risk, risk is an element of uncertainty. So, when we are talking about a change of state and an element of uncertainty, the two of things have to marry for us to ensure that this is given a life and a line item in a product backlog. The product backlog essentially talks about line items that have change incorporated, that have an element of uncertainty incorporated, that have a timeline attached to it. Because all these three things are factored, it becomes a risk adjusted and a sustainable product backlog. So a change that will arise after risk identification is something that has been done in plan-driven initiatives. But during course of backlog refinements, when we see that there's a potent risk that is going to happen, we will talk about alteration then and there itself. That is where the fine element of difference between plan-driven initiatives and adaptive initiatives come into picture. Does this answer your question, sir?
Okay, I guess that's done. Any further questions? Let me see if I've missed any. Okay, Pawan asked another question. Challenge a customer. Can you share a scenario?
Good question. I will explain you this.
From Pawan.
I will talk about this to Pawan. Yeah. Good question. I will talk about this. Essentially, in one of the earlier engagements where I was actually working for a travel, transportation, hospitality customer, he was actually talking about an entity by which we can integrate the initial stage of the project, right? I'm sure, let me actually take a step back and I will tell you how it works. A system, this is essentially something that is driven by input, process, and output. And eventually the outcome is generated to the customer. This is what we call as a SIPOC, system, input, process, output, customer. And there's a feedback system adapted to this. Now, the customer essentially was trying to talk about a paperless ticketing system. The customer was talking about a paperless reservation system. The customer was talking about a paperless pick, board, drop, pick, and then drop. In other words, this is what we call as a global destination system. All of this had multiple levels of interfaces, and then initially we failed the project, but then we got correct requirements in contrast to requirements correct. And we arrived at a solution initially which was thought of 9 months. It took up to 3 years. And then we delivered a solution which is actually for one of the clientele in the Middle East engagements. This was our learning and retrospective. Now, another customer from the Scandinavian and European geographies was talking about a kind of an engagement where he was trying to talk about quasi-automation. In other words, he did not want full automation and he did not want about no automation. He was trying to say that I only want automation at the initial state. I do not want automation at the boarding level. Initially, the customer had 3 vendors, of which I was one among them. I was actually leading the engagement. There were 2 other service providers. One of them told, yes, we can do it. The other person told, we can partially do it. I told openly that this cannot be done. Either this is completely automated or this cannot, this is fully automated. There's nothing like standing in the river and not getting wet. So this customer had a kind of a hammer and a tongs discussion. And then he gave the contract to the other person who told we can do it. I told the management that let's keep quiet. There's something that we learned with our experiences in the Middle East. We know it cannot be done for sure. Whereas the other person has just taken a contract for sure. There are a lot of legal attachments and fringes attached to this tender. Let's keep quiet. Trust me, 6 months down the line, the same customer set up a forum and told, how on earth did you say it cannot be done? I told, please come out to our office, we'll explain. And then we actually briefed the entire technical aspect of solution. And then we told, initially, this is what we were trying to challenge. You are not willing to accept the challenge. But when you have seen the river and the depth of the river for yourself, you have now accepted that we were talking about the truth. We were not interested in a contract that is just for the sake of doing it. We wanted to add value. Now, can you imagine the level of trust and faith the customer would have reposed on us? This is exactly what I meant by saying challenging the customer. Once I challenge the customer feels that I am just not a vendor. I am not a service provider. I am a person who's adding value to his initiative, and he sees that value for himself. He just not becomes a stakeholder. He becomes your future. That is what I meant by that. Does this answer your question, sir? Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Aptly put, Mr. Sheshadri, as well as Pawan too.
Yes.
Thanks for that. And I see we are reaching the end of our session, much as we would not like to. However, I see that some of our board members have joined the session as well. Manohar, Komal, and Venkat. Any comments, or would you like to speak a few words, please? Manohar, would you like to go first? Okay, when Manohar is available. Komal or Venkat?
No, great session, Suma, actually. So I would like to thank Sheshadri on behalf of Charter actually for taking time and joining very good perspectives of the agile transformation and also interesting facts about how we can relate change and risk with respect to the product backlog. And I myself learned many things in the session today. Thank you very much, Sheshadri, for joining us.
That was Venkat, our chapter president, talking to all the attendees. Komal or Manohar?
Suma Komal this side. Thank you so much, Sheshadri, for this wonderful session. In fact, this is the need of the hour in terms of the change wave that has been seen across the organization. So thank you so much once again for taking time out and doing this session for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Anyone else would like to share some comments? Yeah, I see the comments in the chat window as well. Don't worry, Anil, that's the last thing on my agenda, and it's on me to share the PDU information. Just stay on a minute or so more, and we will have it. And I'll request all your comments as well as if any further questions to be on the chat window. And we will be sharing the recording of the session shortly. But I'm glad you joined it in person. The experience of an in-person session or the live session is itself different. Thanks, guys. And we come to the last part, that is the PDU information. We have 1.5 PDUs, 0.75 PDUs in strategic and 0.75 in leadership. Are you not, folks, are you not able to see the PDU slide? Please type in a yes or a no.
We can see.
We can see.
I can see.
Anil, I guess, okay. Right. So don't worry. We will be sharing this information to the attendees. If you have given your correct email ID wherever which you access regularly, we'll be sharing this video information across as well. So not to worry regarding this. All right. And last but not the least, thanks so much on behalf of Praveen, our events director, as well as the rest of the board, and the volunteers who supported in this knowledge sharing session, Shiva and others, for taking us through a wonderful session on change. Thank you, Mr. Sheshadri, and we will wish you a very good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much.